As many of you know, I lived for most of my adult life in Western Massachusetts. But after becoming a minister, I decided to answer a call to serve a congregation in Marietta, Georgia. Now, there are many differences between Georgia and New England, most of which involve smoked meats and very, very sweet tea. But there was another difference that instantly stood out to me as I got to know those who were from the South. Now, maybe it was just unique to the people I met, but I felt like I could always tell a native Southerner from those of us who had been moved down there from the North or from elsewhere, not just by that wonderful Southern drawl they had in their voice, but by the equally wonderful way they told a story. More accurately, by the depth and length of the stories they told. It was not unusual for an innocent question such as, "How was the play you went to last night?" to turn into a complete recap of not only the play, but the meal they had before the play, the people that joined them at dinner that night, the story of the waiter's cousin who had a friend who was in the play, and at least one story about the restaurant owner's pet that somehow they managed to circle back to the original question. This, I noticed, was often in stark contrast to the answer given to a similar question from those of us not from the South. "How was your son's swim meet yesterday?" "It was great." "That's good." "You doing good?" "Yeah, I'm good. Everything's great." "You?" "I'm good too." "Good. All right then. Good. Good." I exaggerate, but maybe just a little, right? In narrative psychology, this is called the difference between a thin story and a thick one. Thin stories are those that don't seem to have much detail or background or nuance. But thick stories, on the other hand, are rich in detail. They explore motives. They express connections between multiple parts of the story. Now, to be clear, I'm not advocating a 20-minute answer to every question, but I do think that those that favor a thick story are onto something very important. While thin stories may be expedient when answering a simple question, when used to get to know someone or to understand a group of people, their lack of nuance too often breeds assumption and misses the very purpose of storytelling, which is to connect. In her 2009 TED Talk called "The Dangers of a Single Story," Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, I practiced that one, speaks about coming to America as a Black woman from Nigeria. Has anybody listened to this TED Talk? If you haven't, I'll put the link in tomorrow in the e-reflections. It's very powerful. It's called "Dangers of a Single Story." She talks about coming to America. She talks about coming to America as a Black woman from Nigeria and about all the assumptions that were made about her. She tells the story of how her new college roommate, when she arrived, was so disappointed when she asked Adichie to share her native music with her. Adichie shrugged and turned on her current playlist, which featured Mariah Carey. Her roommate's confusion continued when she failed to produce the African garb her roommate was sure she must possess. You see, her roommate had only heard one story about the people from Africa, and so couldn't understand why her Nigerian roommate did not fit into that single story that she knew. She never considered that the country of Nigeria on the continent of Africa had its own story, rich in diversity and meaning, different from the one story she had been exposed to. When I listened to Aditya's story, I realized how often I have unintentionally created single stories for others based on one little piece of information, based on assumptions about their age or their place of birth or their accent or any number of other identities. But Adichie warns us, she says, the consequence of the single story is that it robs people of their dignity. The single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Now, I had a powerful personal encounter with this idea several years ago I want to share with you this morning. It was while I was volunteering for an organization called Voices from Inside. They were out of Springfield, Mass. Voices from Inside is a writing group for women. They are a writing group for women who are incarcerated or who were formerly incarcerated. The group was not about learning writing techniques or good grammar. Instead, it was an avenue for women to express themselves, to tell their story, and perhaps as importantly, for their thick stories to be heard by others. The format of the sessions was simple. The women would come in, get settled in, and were given a writing prompt. So they didn't bring in any writing they had previously done. It was just right in that moment. And the writing prompts could be something like my most disappointing moment in life, or sometimes the writing prompts were just a word, space, or friendship. Sometimes the prompts would be a photograph or those little inspiration cards. So after they received the writing prompt, we had 20 minutes of silent writing. So they could write based on the prompt, or they could just write whatever they wanted. And often they wrote in prose, but also in poetry. Sometimes they wrote in journal style. Sometimes they told an actual story. And as they wrote, that room was so silent. It was like this sacred moment for 20 minutes as people really reflected and went deep into their story. Us facilitators were expected to write as well, which was wonderful because it erased that line between facilitating them doing something and us being engaged as well. And at the end of the 20 minutes, the women were given the opportunity to read what they wrote. And while their actual writing skill varied, each person's story had such depth to it. And after each person read, the other woman would reflect back to them maybe a word or a phrase or an idea from their story that they felt especially moved by. And it was such a beautiful and humbling experience to hear the power of what they said. Many of them spoke of their hardships of life in prison. They spoke of not wanting to ever go back to prison, those that were out. Some would speak of loved ones and the impact that their decisions had had on them. Some shared insights into a life of abuse or addiction. And many shared about their courageous victories as they came out of that addiction, as they came out of those abusive relationships. Now, a very important part of the group was the opportunity for women to go out into public and to do their readings. And usually this would be about 6 women, and they would all read 2 or 3 of their pieces that they had previously written. And then they'd open up the floor for questions. And this was something I found out later was their favorite part of the evening. Well, at least it usually was their favorite part, except for this one night I want to tell you about. This particular night was at a readout in UMass Amherst. And on that night, the group of women included 2 Black women, 2 white women, and 2 Hispanic women. And their ages ranged from early 20s to late 70s. After they read their stories, the mic was open for questions. And for some reason, on this particular night, there were very few questions, just a small spattering of questions. And then one person raised their hand, and she stood up to speak. And we all quickly realized she wasn't necessarily asking a question. And instead, she delivered a little mini speech about injustice and inequity and how these women must have experienced multiple intersectional biases, and that systemic mass incarceration in this country was surely the real problem in their lives. She wanted to know what they thought about that. After her speech, the 6 women just looked at her in silence until one of them politely said something to the effect of, "We weren't writing about those things." And then she asked if there were more questions, and there were not, and so the evening ended quite early that night. The next week when the group met, I heard something that changed my own view of justice work and taught me about the power of story. 201, every single woman that was there that night lamented about what a bad night that reading was. Not because their reading was poor, they weren't happy with how they told their story, but because they said the questions were so disappointing. They all agreed that their favorite part of going to a reading had always been the questions afterwards. They said this was because they loved when people asked them about their lives. They asked them about what they had been through and how they got the chance to tell the story and talk about how they were now strong, how they had overcome these hardships, how they had grown and changed. You see, the woman who asked the question that night had done so, what many of us do and what Adichie warned about. That woman asked her question from the perspective of a single story that she felt she knew about women. Surely these women were women who had been victimized, and that is how she viewed them, and that is the story she wanted to talk about. But these women didn't want to talk about that part of their story. They wanted to talk about their victories. They wanted to talk about their overcoming. They wanted to be seen in the light as a hero, not a victim. And what a disservice it was to those women, but also to the rest of us in that room who did not get a chance to hear their story. Adichie continues from her TED Talk saying, "It is impossible to speak about the single story without also talking about power. Power is the ability to not just tell the story of another person, but to make that story the definitive story of that person." Are you thinking of any times that you have done this in your life? Where you've looked at someone and you've thought you knew about them and you story about them in your mind, or listening about them in the news, or met them. Adichie says, show a people as one thing and only as one thing over and over, and that is what they become. Right now, we all know there are lots of stories going around about certain people. They're not stories I'm going to give voice to because I think they are single, thin stories. They're about people that are actually quite thick and multidimensional. Today, there are many stories being told that are intended to define other people, to rob them of their dignity, to try to disempower them by telling them who they are. But this is where we as a community and we as people of justice and love and compassion can make a difference. Back to Adichie, she says, stories matter. She says, stories have been used to dispossess and malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. She says, when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place or people or individual person, we regain a kind of paradise. I reflect on my time with Voices from Inside often, and how my own Savior times has viewed people from a single story, how I wanted to be the hero while they were the victim. I reflect on how often in my personal life I have opted for a thin, expedited story as if I had something better to do than to be present with another human being and listen more about the complexities and nuances of their life. Now, we certainly will not have time to hear the complete and complex life story of everyone we meet, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe it's more about just knowing there is more to the story. Maybe it's about not assuming that we know or understand the complexities of another. Maybe it's about humility and openness. Let me end with this beautiful piece. I edited it for length. I read it at Sharing Locker the other day. It's by Reverend Christina Leon Tracy. It's a story. She says, once upon a time, there was a man with a story. This was his story and no one else's. This story had been carefully crafted. It told of his loves and fears, his dreams realized, and his dreams yet to come. It told his life, whole life, including those bits that still existed in his imagination. He was so happy with his story that he carried it around to make sure it was safe. It was somewhat bulky and unwieldy, but he didn't mind. It was his story. The thing about this story was it was very fragile, made up of many pieces held together by only his imagination, and he worried it might break apart at any minute. And as he grew more and more protective of his story, he held it closer and closer, never sharing it. And he went about his life, and he checked on his story to make sure he was following it correctly. He avoided adventure and unknowns because, well, they might break his story. And then one day, the inevitable happened. Without warning, his story broke. It was unforeseen, and he hadn't done anything wrong at all. But there it was, laying in 1,000 shattered pieces on the ground, with the sunlight glinting off the bits of the story he had so carefully protected for all those years. He was heartbroken. He was at a loss. Now what? He sat down next to the pile of pieces and cried. A while later, a group of people came out of the building nearby and saw him sitting on the sidewalk, surrounded by a pile of broken pieces, clearly in need of help. What happened here? A woman said. My story, it's gone. I worked so hard to build it, to protect it, to keep it from harm, and now it's gone, gone, gone. Is this the story here? A man asked. Yes, look at it. There's nothing left of it. It looks like it's here, not gone, said a child. We just have to put it back together. Put it back together? There's no way. You don't even know what it looked like. How will you put it back together if you don't even know me? But the child was tenacious. Don't worry. We will listen closely to you. And with all of us here to help, the pieces can be put back together. And you never know, it might even be more beautiful than before. And so together they swept up the pieces of the man's story carefully and went together into the building from which they had emerged. They poured him some hot coffee and listened to his tales. And they sang a song he had never heard before, something about dancing through the good times and the bad. The song was inspiring and the coffee was warm, and he began to feel hope again that his story could be put back together. And it took a little time, but that was okay, because the child had been right. It was more beautiful than before. And this time, the story was held together not only by his own imagination, but by the imagination and love and support of the entire community. It wasn't nearly so fragile anymore either, and it even allowed for adventure. Isn't it beautiful? So I say, my friends, let us move forward with an open and welcoming heart for our new members and for all we meet. Let us be ready to share our stories and sit and listen to others, because I think there are a lot of amazing tales in the tapestry of our lives.